For centuries, people have practiced forms of witchcraft in secret, believing that certain rituals could reach beyond the natural world. Some rituals were said to involve candles, symbols, whispered prayers, offerings, or objects belonging to a specific person. Others were meant to summon spirits, place curses, protect a home, or communicate with the dead. The frightening part wasn't always what happened during the ritual. In one remote part of South Dakota, an old house carried a story much like this. After 3 years of dating, finally beginning their married life together felt exciting for both of them. They had always wanted a quiet life in the countryside, and the old two-story house they rented seemed perfect. It had a large backyard, plenty of space, and the rent was comfortably within their budget, allowing them to save for a house of their own. The house had a fairly simple layout. The front door opened into a narrow hallway, with the living room on one side and the kitchen at the back. Just 3 or 4 steps to the right of the entrance was a small room they kept closed from the day they moved in. The ground floor bathroom was nearby, while a staircase farther down the hallway led to the bedrooms upstairs. Then, one evening, Zoe was making dinner while Oliver was still at work. After finishing, she went to the bathroom on the ground floor, and when she came out, she switched off the tap, closed the bathroom door, and started walking toward the kitchen. At that exact moment, the doorbell rang. She smiled, assuming Oliver had finally arrived, and it was him. They spent a few minutes talking before heading toward the kitchen to have dinner. But as they walked past the bathroom, they both heard water running. The bathroom door was also wide open. Zoe immediately realized something was wrong. She clearly remembered turning off the tap and closing the door before leaving. Oliver, exhausted after work, didn't think much of it. He assumed she had simply forgotten. Later that night, while lying in bed, Zoe thought about what had happened. She was still certain she turned the tap off and closed the door, but eventually dismissed it as a simple mistake. The next day passed normally. That evening, they had planned to try a newly opened restaurant in town. Oliver came home, changed his clothes, and went into the bathroom before they left. Zoe waited near the front door and reminded him to switch off all the lights except the living room. Oliver came back out of a moment later, certain that he'd done exactly that. But when Zoe checked the bathroom, its light was still on. Oliver went back and switched it off himself. The incident bothered him more than the previous one. He began wondering whether the old house had some electrical problems, especially since he distinctly remembers switching the light off. For the next week, nothing unusual happened. Then, on a Thursday night, while Oliver and Zoe were having dinner, they suddenly heard something beneath the wooden floor. Scratching. It wasn't a faint or distant. It was loud. The sound continued for several seconds, forcing both of them to stop eating and stare at each other. Oliver moved the rug aside and pressed his ear against the floor. He waited for the scratching to return, but the floor had gone completely quiet. Whatever had made the sound had stopped as suddenly as it had started. He stayed there for another few seconds before standing up. An old pipe, a small animal, or even the wooden boards settling were all possible explanation. Zoe wasn't convinced. Whatever they had heard, she was certain it hadn't sounded like pipes or wood. She insisted that they get a plumber to inspect the house, and Oliver agreed, although the sound remained in the back of his mind for the rest of the night. The next day continued normally, and by morning, the events of the previous night had already started to feel less important to both of them. When Zoe returned home from work that afternoon, however, the memory of the scratching came back to her. The house was empty, and for the first time since moving in, she felt uncomfortable walking into the kitchen alone. She decided to have the plumbing checked before dismissing the incident completely. She called Oliver and asked him to arrange a plumber to come over. A couple of hours later, a plumber arrived at the house. They went through the bathrooms, checked the pipes running through the walls, inspected the kitchen plumbing, and eventually went down into the basement to examine the main lines. The next afternoon, Zoe came home from work. While Zoe was talking to her cousin Henry over the phone in the living room, who also happened to live in Dewey County, she suddenly heard something coming from the hallway. Slow footsteps, followed by the faint sound of fabric dragging across the wooden floor. The footsteps were coming from the direction of the front entrance and slowly moving toward the living room. Zoe's stomach tightened. She stopped talking and listened. The footsteps continued down the hallway. They were getting closer. Then, just before reaching the living room, the sound stopped. Zoe picked up a flower pot from beside the doorway and stepped into the hallway. She looked toward the front entrance. The area was empty. She turned toward the staircase leading upstairs and checked the steps one by one. There was no movement. Then she heard two slow footsteps coming from the small room beside the entrance. The sound moved across the hallway. Zoe turned toward it, and that's when she saw something that made her scream. She never saw the person wearing it. All she saw was a strip of dark, filthy fabric dragging across the wooden floor as something moved through the doorway and disappeared toward the opposite side of the house. Zoe froze for a moment. Then she ran back into the living room. That front door was only a few steps away, but she couldn't bring herself to cross the hallway. Instead, she climbed through the living room window and dropped outside. For the first time since moving into the house, Zoe didn't want to step through its front door. So he called Henry immediately after climbing out of the window and told him what had happened. She then called Oliver and asked him to come home as soon as possible. Nearly an hour later, Oliver arrived. So he was still outside the house waiting for him. She had refused to go back inside after what she had seen. Before entering the house, Oliver and Zoe went to their neighbors, an elderly couple named Mr. and Mrs. Murray. The couple had lived nearby for years and knew the area well. Oliver asked Mr. Murray to accompany him while he checked the house. He took a steel rod with him for protection, while Mr. Murray carried a brick from outside. They entered through the front door and slowly moved through the house, checking each room. The house looked exactly as they had left it. There were no signs of break-in, nothing appeared to have been disturbed, and none of their belongings were missing or damaged. The hallway where Zoe had seen the strange fabric looked completely ordinary. Oliver and Mr. Murray checked the downstairs room, the staircase, the upper floor, and eventually the basement. The search gave them no explanation for what Zoe had experienced. Once they were satisfied that the house was safe, Zoe entered with Mrs. Murray. The couple thanked the Murrays for helping them, and the elderly neighbors returned home. Oliver decided to not return to work that day. Later that evening, Henry came over and stayed with them. So he went over everything again, describing the footsteps, the dragging sound, and the dark fabric she had seen moving through the hallway. Oliver didn't dismiss what she was saying, but he still wasn't ready to accept a supernatural explanation. There had to be something they were missing. Henry decided to stay with Zoe for the next few days so she wouldn't have to be alone in the house. Zoe also took some time off from her part-time job. The following morning, Oliver went to work while Henry stayed with Zoe. With the house quiet around them, the two began discussing everything that happened the previous day. Eventually, they decided that guessing wasn't going to get them anywhere. If something had happened inside that house before they moved in, they needed to find out what it was. So, they decided to start digging into the property's history. They started with the property address. At first, the search gave them very little. The house had changed owners several times, and most of the available records only contained names, dates, and property transfers. There was no mention of anything unusual. Henry suggested checking older newspaper archives and local historical records instead. And that was where things started to change. After going through several old records, Zoe found the first name that seemed connected to this property: Evelyn Mercer. According to an old property record, Evelyn had lived in the house with her husband, Thomas Mercer, many decades earlier. There was nothing unusual about the couple when they first appeared in the records. Thomas worked in the area, and Evelyn was described by neighbors as quiet and private. They had lived in the house for several years without attracting much attention. Then, in the winter of one particular year, Thomas Mercer died. The official record didn't contain much information about his death. He had been found inside the house one morning. There were no signs of forced entry, and the authorities couldn't establish that another person had entered the property. The cause of death was never completely clear. But there was something else. During the investigation, several objects were discovered inside the house. They included pieces of burned wood, dried herbs, candle remains, small animal bones, and several pieces of cloth that appeared to have been deliberately tied around objects. One of the investigators also recorded finding a small bundle containing strand of hair. None of those objects proved that Evelyn had anything to do with her husband's death. But they were enough to start rumors. People in the area began talking about Evelyn. At first, the stories were simple. Some neighbors claimed she stayed awake late into the night. Others said they had seen her walking around the property after midnight carrying a lantern. A few people claimed they had heard strange sounds coming from the house. None of it was enough to establish anything. But after Thomas died, the rumors became much darker. People began saying that Evelyn had been practicing witchcraft. Some believed she had performing rituals inside the house. Others claimed she had been trying to communicate with something. There was no clear evidence supporting those claims. Still, the rumors spread. And then another incident gave the town something more tangible to talk about. A man named Samuel Reed lived several miles away from the Mercer property. Samuel had never been known to have any serious conflict with Evelyn. He wasn't a friend of Thomas. He wasn't a relative. As far as anyone could tell, there was no obvious reason for Evelyn to have any interest in him. Yet, shortly after Thomas' death, Samuel began suffering from a strange illness. According to an account later that given by his family, Samuel became weak and feverish over several weeks. He complained about feeling watched. At night, he began hearing footsteps around his house. Sometimes he thought someone was walking outside his bedroom. Other times, he heard something moving along the walls. His family initially believed he was simply sick and frightened. Then one morning, Samuel's daughter found something buried beneath the window of his bedroom. It was a small bundle wrapped in dark cloth. Inside were several pieces of dried plant material, fragments of bone, strands of hair, and a strip of cloth with Samuel's name written on it. That discovery was never officially connected to Evelyn, but people in town immediately made the connection themselves. The rumors surrounding her became much worse. Samuel eventually recovered enough to leave the area. He moved away and never returned to the house. His family, however, remained in South Dakota. Decades later, his descendants would still tell the story of what happened to him. And that was where Zoe found something unexpected. Samuel Reed's name appeared again in the old records. Not because of his illness, because of what happened afterward. Several months after Samuel left, authorities searched the Mercer property again. This time, the search focused on the basement. Behind an old wooden storage structure, investigators found a small section of wall that appeared to have been altered. Behind it was a narrow space containing what was described as a makeshift table. The table had been heavily burned in several places. There were deep marks carved into its surface. Some appeared to have been symbols, others looked like lines that had been repeatedly scratched into the wood. On the floor around it were pieces of candle wax, dried plants, animal bones, strands of hair, and scraps of paper. The paper were particularly disturbing. Each one contained a name. Some belonged to people who had lived in the area. Some belonged to people who had apparently never had any connection with Evelyn. One of the names was Thomas Mercer. Another was Samuel Reed. The purpose of the ritual, if it had actually been a ritual, was never established. There was no confession from Evelyn, no written explanation, no witness who claimed to have seen her perform anything inside the room. The objects were removed, and the investigation eventually ended. But the rumors surrounding Evelyn continued. According to several later accounts, she became increasingly isolated. She rarely spoke to neighbors. She stopped attending local gatherings. People who passed the house at night sometimes claimed to see a light moving from room to room. Others reported hearing sounds from inside the property long after midnight. And several residents described something strangely specific. They claimed that during the early hours of morning, they sometimes heard someone walking outside their homes. The footsteps were slow, unhurried, but they were accompanied by another sound. It sounded like someone wearing clothing that was far too long, with the fabric sweeping across the ground behind them. Some people looked through their windows. Others opened their doors. A few claimed they saw a figure moving along the road, but nobody could describe the person clearly. The reports were never officially connected to Evelyn. Still, as the rumors surrounding her grew, people began associating the nighttime footsteps with the Mercer house. Then, one day, Evelyn disappeared. There was no dramatic confrontation, no records of her leaving town, no confirmed sighting of her afterward. Her clothes were still inside the house. Her personal belongings were still there. The authorities searched the property and the surrounding area. They searched nearby roads. They searched the surrounding fields. They even searched the nearby waterways. Evelyn Mercer was never found. Her disappearance remained unexplained. Some people believe she had murdered her husband and fled. Others believed she had been involved in something dangerous and had eventually paid the price. And some continue to insist that she had been practicing witchcraft. But there was one problem with every explanation. Nobody could explain where she had gone. Afterward, the house changed hands several times. Different families lived there. Some stayed for years, others left after a short period. But the record Zoe found contained no reports of anything resembling what she and Oliver had experienced. No unexplained footsteps, no water turning on by itself, no lights behaving strangely, and no reports of someone moving through the house at night. For decades, the property appeared completely ordinary. That was what made Zoe uncomfortable. If the stories about Evelyn were true, why had nothing happened to the people who lived in there afterward? Why had the house remained quiet for so long? And why had everything started only after she and Oliver moved in? Zoe continued searching. For the first time, Zoe began wondering whether the story everyone in town had been telling for decades was it complete. Maybe Evelyn hadn't simply disappeared. Maybe something had happened to her inside that house. Zoe closed the records and sat quietly for a moment. She still didn't know what had happened to Evelyn or whether any of the old stories were even true. But one thing bothered her more than everything else: the reports about the strange footsteps, the slow walking, the sounds of fabric dragging across the ground behind whoever was making them. It was the exact sound she had heard inside her own house. And if the accounts were accurate, people had been hearing it long before she and Oliver ever moved in. So he looked toward the hallway. The answer wasn't going to come from another newspaper article. She needed to find out what was inside that house. Once they were all together, Zoe and Henry told him everything they had discovered in the old records and the newspaper accounts. They explained Evelyn Mercer, the death of her husband, the accusation of witchcraft, the strange objects found in the house, Samuel Reed's illness, and the reports of the footsteps that people had heard outside their homes decades earlier. Oliver still wasn't ready to accept that something supernatural was happening. But after everything Zoe had experienced, the history of the house made him uncomfortable. Even if there was a rational explanation for what had been happening, knowing what had taken place there was enough to make the house feel different. Later that evening, the three of them were sitting in the living room, talking about unrelated things when they heard a knock. It had came from somewhere inside the house. Zoe's face immediately changed. She reached for Oliver's hand. A second knock followed. This one was louder. Henry slowly stood up and looked toward the hallway. Oliver followed him, with Zoe close behind. The sound had clearly come from the small room beside the entrance, the room they had kept closed since moving in. They walked toward it together. For several moments, the hallway remained quiet. Then, they heard it. The same slow footsteps Zoe heard the previous afternoon. The same sound of long fabric sweeping across the wooden floor. The footsteps moved around inside the closed room. They could hear them traveling from one side to the other. Then, they stopped, directly opposite the door. Oliver and Henry looked at each other. For the first time, Oliver didn't have an explanation. They waited beside the door, but the footsteps didn't return. Eventually, they decided they had to see what was inside. Oliver called the landlord and tried to explain what was happening, but the call went unanswered. After waiting several minutes, they decided to break the lock. It took considerable effort, but eventually the wood lock gave way. The door opened. The room looked as though it had been untouched for decades. Cobwebs covered the corners of the ceiling and stretched between pieces of old furniture. A wooden table sat against one wall, its surface buried beneath dust. Several old candles rested on it, their wax completely hardened, and old papers and books were scattered across the nearby shelves, their pages yellowed with age. Everything appeared abandoned. Then they noticed the things that didn't belong. One candle had fresh wax running down its side. One of the chairs had very little dust on its seat. There was also a faint smell of burnt herbs and smoke lingering in the room, despite the fact that the door had supposedly remained closed for years. Oliver began looking around more carefully. That's when he noticed that part on the floor looked different. They moved the wooden table aside. Beneath, it was a section of flooring that had been deliberately reinforced. At its center was an old iron lock. The lock itself was heavily rusted, but the keyhole was strangely clean. Almost no dust had gathered around it. It looked as though someone had been touching it. The three of them stood there for a moment, staring at it. Whatever had happening in that house, this room clearly had something to do with it. They decided to break the lock. After several attempts, the old metal finally snapped. The wooden panel shifted. Beneath, it was a narrow opening leading into darkness. Zoe brought two flashlights and a lantern from the house. Oliver went down first, followed by Henry, and Zoe came behind them. The stairs led into a small hidden cellar beneath the house. The air was colder down there. There were old shelves along the walls, covered with dry herbs, candles, small containers, and animal bones. Everything about the room matched the objects described in the historical records. Then, Henry's light moved in toward the far corner. A figure was sitting in a wooden chair. For a moment, none of them moved. It was a corpse. The body was dressed in a dark, filthy gown. The lower part of the garment was long enough to spread across the floor. It was the same fabric Zoe had seen moving through the hallway the day before. Zoe recognized it immediately. She backed away, and Oliver and Henry followed. They left the cellar and immediately contacted the police. Officers arrived and searched the property. The hidden cellar was documented, and the objects inside were collected as evidence. But when they returned to the cellar to examine the body, the chair was empty. There was no corpse, no body, no trace that anyone had been sitting there. The cellar contained the same old candles, herbs, animal bones, and other objects they had discovered earlier. But the woman was gone. The police searched the property again, but nothing explained how a corpse could have disappeared from a sealed underground room. Oliver and Zoe didn't wait for an explanation. The following morning, they left the house for good. After everything they had experienced, neither of them wanted to spend another night there. The landlord was informed about what had happened, but after the police investigation and the discovery of hidden cellar, the property was never rented out again. Word about the house spread through the surrounding communities. People began talking about the old property, and the woman who had once lived there. Some were curious enough to drive past it, while others deliberately avoided the road. But over time, people who lived nearby began reporting strange things. Some claim they could hear slow footsteps coming from the empty house late at night. Others, they had heard the familiar sound of fabric dragging across the floor, even while standing outside the property. A few neighbors refused to go near the house after dark, saying they sometimes felt as though someone was watching them from inside. The house remained empty. No new tenants ever stayed there, and whatever had been inside it before Oliver and Zoe arrived seemed to remain there long after they were gone. The house was empty, but it never truly felt unoccupied.